alas, I have no harpoon, but we'll carry on. It's great to be with you in Baltimore today, virtually, talking about a story influenced by Poe, appropriately enough.
JoAnn, before you go too far, can you click on display settings and switch over the view?
Roger that.
And that top option.
I think I need to swap screens. Yeah.
There we go.
There.
We're good.
Are you good?
We're very good.
Awesome. Now, J. Habakuk Jephson's statement was a breakthrough story for Doyle. It helped launch his career as a writer. And not only that, with his writing magic, he helped create the Mary Celeste legend that we know today. And when I say today, I mean it. Literally, in the middle of a pandemic. If you look on social media, you will find a few examples like this one. People sharing posts around the world of empty streets, the doctor's office, their own office, with references to the Mary Celeste in some format. Basically to describe a scene that's empty and abandoned. And the one you see here is about a year old. It's an Instagram post from Wales. And you'll note that the empty abandoned scene as described is as Mary Celeste-esque. And anytime you see a reference to the ship is Marie, excuse me, not Mary, that is Doyle. He's the one that changed the name of the ship and popularized its use on both sides of the Atlantic. Before we look at the fiction that he wrote, let's look at the facts. Strangely enough, the ship did not start out as Mary Celeste. It was originally called Amazon and was built right here in Nova Scotia on the shores of the Bay of Fundy at a place called Spencer's Island, which is about 2 hours or so from Halifax. Amazon was launched in the spring of 1861. It was built by a man named Joshua Dewis. He and a group of local business people and his neighbors owned the cargo vessel. And the painting you see here was painted during those first few years. In this depiction, Amazon is at the port of Marseille in France. Can't see it very well, but the old port of Marseille with the fortified castles is in the background. Now, the fate of Amazon changed after about 6 years in the cargo trade. The ship was loading coal off Cape Breton Island from the mines there in the fall of 1867 and was badly damaged during a storm. At that time, the local owners decided to cut their losses. The ship was declared a wreck, and the speculators got involved. As a result, the ship changed hands a couple of times, first in Canada and then in the States, ends up in New York with a new name and a new owner. Obviously, the ship is now called Mary Celeste. No one knows why it was called Amazon in the first place, and we don't know why it was Mary Celeste either. Those details have been lost in time. Once the ship gets to the States, it's repaired a few times, enlarged, and basically after a few rounds of repairs, it's essentially a new ship. You know, in my heart, it's still a Nova Scotia vessel, but Mary Celeste was no longer Amazon. So and the ship continued sailing out of the port of New York, cargo vessel, fall of 1892, or pardon me, in 1872, there's another new ownership group. Vessel gets fresh repairs, prepares to sail again. One of the new owners in the group is Captain Benjamin Briggs from Marion, Massachusetts. Captain Briggs formed a 7-member crew to go on the ship's initial voyage with him at the helm. They were 3 American soldiers and 4 German soldiers, and sadly it was the only trip that Captain Briggs and his crew would make aboard the Mary Celeste. Joining them on the voyage was Mrs. Briggs, Sarah, and the couple's 2-year-old daughter, Sophie. Now you don't see Sophie here. This is the photo shows the little boy, or pardon me, the little boy Arthur. Arthur stayed at home with his family in Massachusetts. He was 7 years old and he continued in school. So it was Sarah Briggs and the little girl who was Sophia, not Sophie, who made the trip. The Sophies are in the canon, and obviously there's a Briggs, the Matilda Briggs, in the canon as well. The voyage was to take 1,700 barrels of industrial alcohol to Genoa, Italy, and it wasn't unusual for Mrs. Briggs to travel with her husband. He was an experienced captain and obviously was away at sea a lot. After Mary Celeste left the port of New York that day, it wasn't seen again for a month. So if you fast forward to December 4th, 1872, the next time Mary Celeste is seen again, ironically, it's spied by another Nova Scotia brigantine, the De Gracia. The captain is David Morehouse, and the first mate is Oliver Deveau. They're both from Nova Scotia as well. Captain Morehouse and his crew, they spy the Mary Celeste off in the distance. Things seem to be a little off kilter. They hail the Mary Celeste. There's no response. So a team rows over to check out, and what they find is mysterious indeed. There was no sign of any of the 10 people who had been on board Mary Celeste, and really no clear indication of what had happened to them. But there were a few clues. De Gracia found about 3.5 feet of water in the hold, which was a fairly large amount for a small cargo ship. The cabin was wet and the windows were boarded over. The logbook was found in the mate's cabin. The last entry had been made 9 days earlier. At that time, Mary Celeste was about 10 kilometers off the coast of Santa Maria in the Azores. And the ship was still near the Azores and Portugal, but had drifted for many hundreds of kilometers over those 9 days. Some important papers and also gear were missing. The ship's chronometer, the captain's sextant, also the ship's register in the navigation book as well. Another puzzling fact was that the ship's boat, which today we would call a light boat, was gone. Now these are some of the facts that Doyle changed to add drama to his story. He said that Marie Celeste was found in perfect condition. It was not. It was rather obvious that the ship had been through bad weather in its journey across the Atlantic. Doyle also said there were multiple ship's boats and they were all still there unused. That was not correct. One ship's boat and it was missing. Also interesting among the facts is what was still in the ship included the oilskins, the boots, and the pipes that belonged to the sailors. So that suggested to some of the theorists about what may have happened to the ship that they left in a hurry, because why would you go without your pipe if you were a sailor? What Captain Morehouse and his crew figured is that during a storm, Captain Briggs and company feared that Mary Celeste was sinking. The conditions were so bad they decided to launch the ship's boat and try and make it to Santa Maria. With no sign of those on board, De Gracia decided to continue on to Gibraltar. That's the port it was bound for. And the crew split into a team. So they also sailed the Mary Celeste with them. And it's when they got to Europe that the headlines started about this so-called ghost ship found empty and abandoned, and also the speculation about what may have happened to those 10 people on board. And it would be a few years later that Doyle would jump into the fray and stoke the fire, so to speak. At the time, the ship started making headlines because it had been found empty and abandoned. Doyle was a boy. He was, or pardon me, a teenager. He was studying at Stonyhurst, but he did take notice of the headlines about Mary Celeste. We know this because his friend Robert Barr, the Scottish-Canadian author and editor, wrote an article about Doyle's interest in the Mary Celeste for McClure's in 1894. Now, obviously, besides being interested in Mary Celeste from a young age, Doyle went to sea twice as a young man as a ship's doctor, and we know this influenced his fiction, including J. Habakuk Jephson's statement. It was on the second voyage that Doyle met the man you see here, Henry Highland Garnet. Reverend Garnet was an American diplomat, former slave, and an abolitionist. And he was born in Maryland, interestingly enough. The two men met on the return trip that Doyle was making aboard Mayumba, and obviously Andrew Lycett talked about Mayumba last week during his BSI lecture. The two men spent time together on the boat, talking about the things they had in common: history, books, some of their favorite authors, and travel. And of course, this included travel in Africa. And less than 2 years later, Doyle writes a story that features a refined, well-spoken man of mixed race. Sounds a lot like Reverend Garnet, although the character was a deranged killer. Doyle was a young man in his 20s when the statement was published. New doctor trying to establish his practice in South Sea, not a lot of patients, obviously lots of time to write. The statement wasn't his first published story, nor was it his first sea tale. In fact, the reason he pitched it to the Cornhill was because Captain of the Pole Star had been published the year before, and he didn't want to send the same story to Temple Bar, that magazine, so he pitched to the Cornhill instead. Basically, he had written a similar story, first-hand account, sailor's tale, and told in a diary format. We know Doyle ended up hitting the jackpot with the Cornhill and this story in more ways than one. The 30 guineas he received for it was a lot of money at that time. It was enough to pay his rent at Bush Villas for about a year, and more importantly was the literary acclaim the story received after it was published in January 1884. Now, the magazine's style was to publish without naming the author. That led to some of the literary critics commenting on the work to muse that maybe it was written by Stevenson or Poe. Certainly sounded like one of their sea tales. Readers wondered the same thing and sent letters to the magazine asking who the author was. Now, Doyle was quite amused by the speculation, and you can also imagine it was pretty good for his ego to be compared to the likes of these better-known writers. And he was also pleased by the story's success. He felt that it took his literary career. It was a big boost for him. So what did he write? Why did it resonate with the readers and the critics? J. Habakuk Jephson's statement is a mix of fact and fiction. A lot of readers could relate to the real life story. They would be familiar with it from the events they had seen in the newspapers, in the headlines, a decade earlier. The story solves the mystery with a plot about revenge and also racial hate. This theme is also what helps make the tale a product of its time. the way the Black characters are portrayed, even the story's illustrations, are definitely racist today. There's no question about that. Doyle did add drama to his story by changing some of the facts. He also added details that seemed real. An example is the bobbin of sewing silk found on Mrs. Briggs's sewing machine. Her sewing machine certainly was found in the cabin, but we don't know anything about any thread that may have been found there with it. Doyle also gives the Gothic treatment to some of the goings-on aboard Mary Celeste. The title character gives a first-hand account of increasingly strange and sinister events, which often occur at night. More than once, Dr. Jephson writes that being in his cabin makes him feel trapped in a coffin. Being buried alive at sea certainly sounds a lot like Mr. Pym of Nantucket, doesn't it? And there's another possible Poe allusion. It's the change that Doyle made in the ship's name. Some Doyleans say that he called the ship Marie Celeste as a nod to Marie Roget, another Poe story. And it's interestingly also a fictionalized account of a real life event that had made a real life event that had made headlines years earlier, although in that case it was a murder. Now, some Doyle biographers say the mix of fact and fiction is just an early example of Doyle's carelessness. I tend to disagree. I do think most of the changes that he made to names, dates, and other details were deliberate. He said as much in a letter to James Payn, the publisher of the Cornhill. Payn had written Doyle a letter saying, after the story started making a stir, saying, how much of it is true anyway? Is any of it true? Obviously, Payn started to experience the magic of Doyle's writing too. And Doyle said he did change some of the details, names, dates. It was deliberate. If we look at a few examples here, the ship, obviously we've already talked about Mary Celeste becomes Marie Celeste. No change in the name of De Gracia, it stayed the same. Doyle changes the date that the ship is found. It's a year later, these historical events occur, 1873 instead of 1872. This is one that it's gotten me, the map coordinates where De Gracia was reported found, or pardon me, Mary Celeste was reported found by De Gracia. I've given more than one talk where I've said that Doyle didn't change the map coordinates, and guess what? He did. When I went back recently and did a little refresh, I could see he's changed the latitude by about 20 minutes. So darn you, Doyle, you got me too. I can't keep the fact and fiction straight either. Captain Briggs of Mary Celeste becomes Captain Tibbs, and the name of De Gracia captain is also changed. He becomes Captain Dalton instead of Captain Morehouse. Even the children, even the name of the child, the infant Sophia, she becomes a little boy, and his name is Dottie. Now, I think obviously, you know, you can see facts that are changed, facts that stay the same. Some of them are very obvious, and others I think are more subtle and difficult to spot. I think it's rather clever in Doyle's part. And yes, there are facts about the story that don't add up. For example, one thing that's mentioned is that Dottie, the boy, is 5 years old, but just learning to walk. One would think that a doctor, even a newly graduated one, would know better. Even with its flaws, the story was a big deal for Doyle. It garnered a lot of recognition for him. But more importantly, for the Mary Celeste, it also renewed speculation about what had happened to the ghost ship. It drove, Doyle and his work drove that interest to a new pitch. Many survivors' tales and deathbed confessions followed his. Some of them are short stories, some of them are full-length novels. An example here is a short story, Abel Fosdick's story, which was published in the Strand in 1913. It's one of the better ones. Like Doyle, people thought it was real. Same sort of format, deathbed confession, survivor's tale. And in this one, you can see here's a photo of supposedly of the captain's daughter. And here her name has been changed to Baby. And if you're okay with spoiler alerts, with a spoiler, I will tell you that most of the bad things that happen in this account involve sharks, many, many sharks. Now, Doyle's story had such an impact, but besides making it a case that readers couldn't get enough of these stories, publishers couldn't turn them out fast enough. The newspapers loved to speculate about the latest story, like Doyle's, what's real, what isn't. Doyle also gets credit for these days, for aspects of the legend that were created by somebody else. An example would be William Clark Russell. Dr. Watson's favorite author was the one who wrote a story about the ghost ship that said the vessel was discovered with a fire still burning in the gallery kitchen and a hot meal on the table. That's how quickly people had departed. Doyle did not write this, but it's a legend. It's part of the legend that still resonates today, and Doyle still gets credit for it. So what a testament to the power of his writing, and also the way we're still captivated with an unsolved mystery, especially one that occurs at sea. And many of these tales have been told over the years. They started in the written page, and now we get our Mary Celeste stories from film, television, big screen, small screen. If you look on YouTube, you can find, there's even a Mary Celeste Hammer film from the 1930s, Bela Lugosi, so you will see the terror treatment to this story on screen. And obviously, if you look on social media and you see a post and it says Marie Celeste, and it's during the pandemic, we know exactly who deserves the credit. Thank you, Arthur Conan Doyle.
Greg, you're muted.
Welcome to the Verizon Zoom meeting. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
That was meant for Greg. You might want to unmute yourself.
I apologize to the viewers of this this meeting. I have gone off the agenda. For those people who were on the agenda beforehand, we will be going back to you in a minute. However, if you're going to ask a question, if you can please type that in the chat feature, and I will call on you to unmute and ask your question. Right now, we have no questions that I can see, so we're doing good here.
I had one.
What is your question, Brenda?
I wanted to know what influence the Reverend Garnett had specifically upon Conan Doyle.
Well, Doyle does write about his encounter, his meeting with Reverend Garnett in Memories and Adventures. He recounts what they talked about on that voyage, and there's a lot of similarity. The character may very well have been influenced. The character of Septimius Goring, the antagonist in the statement, may very well have been based on Reverend Garnett. Doyle biographers, several of them say the character, even though he's turned into an evil guy, was probably influenced by the impression that Reverend Garnett made on Doyle.
Doyle was not a racialist, though, with Reverend Garnett. He respected him, didn't he?
Yes, yes, he did. He did. It did very. He did very much. Certainly, turning turning the well-spoken, refined man into an evil character would not have been a reflection on Reverend Garnet. It was certainly inspired by probably inspired by Reverend Garnet, but obviously that part of it was made up. An example of Doyle's mix of fact and fiction.
Thank you, JoAnn. So wonderful.
Thank you, Brenda. Anne Marlowe has a question. Anne, can you unmute yourself, please?
Yeah, JoAnn, what is your idea about what happened on the ship?
Well, the most obvious thing is, it probably the most obvious thing is probably the simplest one. The fact that the ship was wet. They probably felt it was sinking and decided they were better off in the shipped boat trying to make it to Santa Maria. It was only 10 kilometers away. Another popular theory, and there's a Smithsonian documentary out there on that puts forward that
I read
theory.
that.
You've seen that one,
I read
Anne?
that, yes.
Yeah, there's a Smithsonian documentary quite recently about that one. The other theory that's out there, and you'll find documentaries on this one too, is that there was a problem with the cargo, the industrial alcohol, gas buildup. They were afraid there was going to be an explosion. And that, as that theory goes, is that they left the ship temporarily. Went out on the ship's boat, possibly with a tie line, because some of the rigging was missing. Some of the running rigging was missing, so people thought maybe they just went out there to let the ship fumigate, because obviously they didn't take their rain slickers and their boots with them. And the wind came up, the tow line snapped, and horribly they were carried off and lost at sea when they were just trying to fumigate the ship and get back on it.
If they were trying in the first theory just to, the ship was wet and they decided to go to a nearby island, why didn't they bring their rain slickers and stuff?
Well, that's one of the points that doesn't support that theory. If the weather was bad, why didn't they take the rain gear? The rain gear may have been an indication, a sign that they left in a hurry. They were in too much of a rush. There was some sort of emergency, although even the ship sinking could have been an emergency, but you'd think you would have grabbed your raincoat. So the fact the raincoat was there, the raincoats were there, sort of points to the problem with the cargo. The gas buildup theory supports that.
So although my question, you answered the question, what theories are there? And I asked, what do you think happened? I think you've answered that in that you don't know. It's still a mystery.
Well,
Great
yeah,
idea.
no, I was a little wishy-washy. I think they probably tried to get to Santa Maria. It was only 10 kilometers away. Doesn't sound very far away to us, but probably in a rowboat in the middle of, a rowboat in the Atlantic Ocean. It was probably, a terrible, risky journey they were trying to make.
I forget. I think somebody in the Smithsonian looked up what the weather was that night, and it was not impassable. There were waves.
The weather 9 days earlier?
The weather the night that they would have abandoned the ship.
Yep. No, the weather has been researched. All the wave patterns, the sea heights. There's been research all on that as well to figure out how far did the ship drift? How many kilometers did it drift in those 9 days?
Yes. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne. I'm not seeing any other questions here, so I'm going to let JoAnn go with my thanks for a wonderful presentation. As I mentioned earlier, JoAnn is the co-editor of Canadian Homes. If a little bit later on in the meeting here, if JoAnn could share the website for the bootmakers in the